NAFI would like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this episode, Sporties. If you are a NAFI member, Sporties offers a 20% discount on a wide range of their training products. Go to nafinet.org, log in using your membership credentials, and head to the NAFI member discounts page. On there, you'll find a link and the discount code. There's also a link in the show notes. Listeners to this podcast can also receive a $10 discount on their NAFI membership, whether you are joining for the first time or renewing your membership. Use the code POD, P-O-D, 49, POD49 at checkout. Be sure to visit nafinet.org for more details about the benefits of becoming a member and to join or renew. Also, be sure to subscribe to More Right Rudder anywhere you get your podcasts to not miss an episode.
Today's guest is Dr. William Hoffman. He is a former aviation medical examiner, neurologist, and aircrew brain health researcher who studies aeromedical screening and healthcare behavior. He is an affiliated assistant professor of aviation at the University of North Dakota John D. Odegaard School of Aerospace Science, and he leads the Aerospace Medical Association Mental Health Research Subgroup. He is an internationally invited speaker and writer on pilot health behavior, including CNN, CBS News, Scientific American, MedPage Today, and now NAFI's More Right Rudder podcast. Dr. Hoffman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Beth. It's really a privilege to be with you today.
Well, we are so happy to have you here. And for our listeners and watchers, the May-June issue of Mentor magazine was the medical issue. And in this issue of Mentor, we had articles that focused on both physical and mental pilot health, which the mental aspect of it is a relatively recent phenomena. And Dr. Hoffman wrote this article in Mentor magazine. And before we get started, Dr. Hoffman, what should we call you? Should we call you Dr. Hoffman, or should we call you something less?
I was just going to say, Billy's perfect.
Billy. Well,
I appreciate
Billy,
the formality.
Dr. Billy.
I'm
Well,
just like, I see, there's all the formality, but I also see myself, like I'm sure many of your listeners, I just want to hang out with pilots and talk about airplanes.
Well, and I would really, so on that note, tell us a little bit about your background. I sort of read your boilerplate bio, that is in, your byline of all of the illustrious publications that you are in. Tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got to be where you are and doing the work that you're doing.
Of course. Well, first off, a very warm note of thanks to you, Beth, and the whole organization for not only the opportunity to be a part of this publication, but also for the focus that you guys have on the health of pilots. You guys are truly leaders in this charge, and of course, the scope that you have with the flight instructors and training a whole generation of pilots to come has an incredible impact. So thank you for your hard work and commitment to this. Like many of your listeners, I'm a lover of aviation. From a very young age, I'm a recreational pilot. And my day job is I'm a neurologist caring for patients and pilots and non-pilots with neurological disorders. But also, several years ago became interested in this topic about the barriers that pilots face in seeking care. While it's often common knowledge to pilots and many of the physicians that help take care of them, it really wasn't until recently that it became clear the quantifiable barrier that some pilots report related to addressing health concerns. And for many pilots, this is about the fear of losing their certificate, which can result in negative occupational, social, and financial repercussions. And so this started this journey of how do we how do we build data to help decision making, building the aerospace system of the future, where we optimize the health of pilots and also the safety of our aviation system. And it's a privilege to learn from people like you and many of your listeners along the way.
So tell us a little bit about the data-driven work that you're doing and also some of the changes that you've noticed that have happened just in the recent past, just like in the past months and years, actually. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about the FAA committee that had its findings that wrapped up in April of this year.
Absolutely. Well, there is a lot to talk about because when I talk about this topic, I say 2023 and 2024 are the years of mental health in aviation. And so, where did this all start? Perhaps many of your listeners might agree that how open we are about talking about mental health in aviation, it appears, has changed a lot in the couple of years in positive ways. Um, some time ago, a question became, how prevalent is the worry that pilots face in seeking medical care? And in several years ago, we tried to quantify the prevalence of healthcare avoidance. That is, behavior that would be at odds with addressing health concerns due to fear for loss of flying status. And thanks to the help of many, we were able to study over 5,000 pilots across North America, the United States, and Canada, and found that over 50% reported a history of healthcare avoidance due to fear for certificate loss. Now, certainly while there's limitations in these types of data, we felt it was a valuable piece of data that helped try to quantify the problem that we see clinically, and that is this worry about addressing health concerns and seeking care. And this was one small piece of a very large pie of this growing momentum that related to rethinking how do we what should mental health and mental wellness mean in the aviation system of the future? And in the setting of these publications and others, and unfortunately, some events that have happened in the media in the last couple of years related to near misses or incidences related to mental health, it's really been thrust into the foresight. And a couple of key events happened. Of course, there was the Horizon Air incident in October, followed by the National Transportation Safety Board's Roundtable on Mental Health, convened by Chair Jennifer Homendy in Washington, D.C., where they charged really the whole aviation community to say, how do we address the barriers that pilots and other safety-sensitive personnel face in addressing mental health care? We had the privilege of attending that and testifying about some of the data that exists related to this. And then this coalesced, these many stories coalesced into what we were very excited about, which is this Aviation Rulemaking Committee on Mental Health that convened in the late kind of winter of 2023 that released its report very recently. And of course, it's a light 164-page document, so it's a perhaps light reading, but we feel was a meaningful step towards momentum in creating the future that we all want to see.
So tell us a little bit about what we do next. So there's these studies. So you've done studies. The FAA Rulemaking Committee had these findings with testimony, data, research, all that kind of stuff. What happens next?
It's an important and a complicated question. So, the FAA Aviation Rulemaking Committee started by trying to explain the problem. What is the problem that we're actually trying to address? And as stated in the mission of this organization, of this group, so of course, an Aviation Rulemaking Committee, ARC or an ARC, is a group of people who are not affiliated with the FAA directly that come together and they have relevant knowledge or expertise in various fields to generate a document with recommendations. How should the FAA address a problem? And of course, this can be outside of healthcare. So, drone operations, for example, is an example of an ARC. But this one was specifically focused on mental health. So charging the group to provide recommendations on how to address the barriers that personnel face in addressing mental health concerns. So first, we needed to outline the barriers. And there are several projects underway trying to study this problem in a systematic way. And it's a complicated problem because different people within the industry face different types of barriers. So for example, an airline pilot for a mainline US air carrier who may have disability insurance, may have paid time off, may have union protection, may face different types of barriers than a pilot in a training setting. For example, maybe they're at a university training program taking on lots of student debt and they have the pressure to graduate in a certain amount of time. Different people face different barriers. And of course, in an industry that's rapidly evolving and the people that are coming in are coming from different backgrounds, this problem may only become more complicated. But many of the common barriers that, as outlined in the FAA's document, talk about things like concern for certificate loss, stigma, culture, uncertainty, and others. And this comes to an important point, is that when we think about the problem, I see that there's a lot of fingers pointed in different directions. This person needs to do this, needs to do that. But really what became clear to me in being involved in this process was understanding that we all have a role to play. Advocacy organizations play a role in education. Regulatory organizations play a role in certification processes. Instructing organizations have a role in teaching health literacy, teaching how to process or how to participate in these processes. We're probably all going to have some health condition at some point in our life. We're probably all going to have to navigate the special issuance process or the AME process to some degree. How do we empower people with the knowledge of that? So that's became clear. So one was identifying the barriers. Well, then next, what were the recommendations about how do we address those barriers? And there are 24 recommendations with many pages of reading, but there are some key ones that I think it's worth highlighting. One, the first recommendation is removing the requirement to disclose talk therapy under appropriate circumstances and with oversight. And what we're already seeing is so in late May, that recommendation in some ways was operationalized with a change in the AME certification policy related to mental health. So we're already seeing some action, but there are many other recommendations. This includes understanding if we can put limitations on people's certificates, for example, flying with another pilot, disability insurance, medications for ADHD and others. So there's a lot to it.
So you touched on the recent shift at the end of May. Let's talk. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And if you were to listen to any part of this podcast very closely, I hope that your instructor listeners will really listen to this part, because we all have a role to play in sharing accurate information as relates to mental health. And this is a really exciting piece of information that I hope that we can share with students and pass along, because in a lot of ways, I see this as a big win. And in the end of May in 2024, the FAA rolled out new certification guidance related to mental health. And this information can be seen by Googling FAA AME guide, and there's some hyperlinks that have the actual primary data. So if a listener is interested in actually reading it for yourself from the FAA, that's how you access it. Google FAA AME guide and see the hyperlink that says uncomplicated depression and other conditions, and you can see the actual tables. But maybe what I can do is briefly summarize what are the important takeaways.
Yes.
The FAA clarified 11 diagnoses that include generalized anxiety disorder, depression unspecified, adjustment disorder, and others. And these are just descriptive terms that would be relevant for your healthcare provider that's trying to bill something, but can be easily summarized as simple as this: garden variety mental health symptoms and conditions. So the FAA listed diagnoses that they had considered garden variety, and a pilot can have one or two of those diagnoses in the medical chart. And importantly, as long as they meet all of 9 criteria, they can actually receive a medical certificate in the AME's office without any additional steps. So they can have 2 diagnoses, and as long as they meet all these criteria, they can get a certificate. But the most exciting part about it, in my opinion, is that the pilot can be actively seeking talk therapy and still get a certificate as long as all the other criteria are met. So yeah.
That's a big deal. This is a really big deal, and the timing of our chat. We're talking early June here, and this just happened last week. So this is. It seems like, and then the ARC, the rulemaking committee, they finished up at the end of April. So there's a lot of stuff happening. Like you said, 2023, 2024 seems to be there's like some momentum building. I noticed that one of the, I guess one of the 9 criteria that you mentioned, and thank you for pointing out where folks can find this and look into it in more detail. I believe one of them is you had to be off, so you could have up to 2 garden variety diagnoses, but you also had to not be on medication for the past 2 years. I think that was one of them. So let's talk a little bit about, I know that there are more medications that pilots are now able to take that are okay to take while you're still flying. And that's, so let's talk a little bit about that. So I know that there's more medications for I think depression and anxiety type medications that in the past were deal breakers, but now pilots can be on these medications and still fly. So let's talk a little bit about the medication, because based upon this new rule, yeah, it's all well and good, but you can't be actively, having treatment with medication, as far as I understand it.
That's a great point, and I'm so glad you brought it up because it is complicated. It is very complicated. You know, for example, we can't take a blood test and quantify somebody's mood. It's very subjective, and it's subjective based on the circumstance. It's highly dynamic, and it makes it very difficult, even in clinical practice, for us really to know how best to identify and address mental health symptoms, let alone think about it with a safety hat on. Um, and so what I would say is you can absolutely be on a medication and have a medical certificate. You can absolutely have a diagnosis that's not listed on that form and get a medical certificate. And you can have a more complicated psychiatric history and still get a medical certificate. What was developed and launched, at the end of May is deferring some of that decision making at a lower level.
Mm.
So now there are fewer things that need an FAA review. So if a pilot doesn't clearly meet those criteria, they still can get a certificate, but instead they're going to need to go through a special issuance process, which means that they might get, there's a very good chance that they're going to get a certificate, assuming they complete all the relevant testing and meet the criteria. But it's a different process. So as relates to medications, there are a host of medications that pilots can be on and receive a medical certificate. There is a various series of tests and evaluations that need to occur before that can be finally approved. But pilots are actively flying in the airlines, they're actively flight instructing, they're actively in our aerospace system on these medications and flying extremely successfully. So that is a foot stomping point that I hope instructors will take away and tell patients, tell pilots, this is a possibility. What I wouldn't suggest is, I guess maybe I'll frame it this way. If a pilot is out there facing mental health symptoms that can't be addressed with therapy alone and they might need a medication, under every single circumstance, it is best for the pilot to focus on their health first. Mm-hmm. Focus on the health, get better, go back, find clinical stability, and that's when we start talking about getting a medical certificate again. Going the opposite direction, how do I keep my certificate and then navigating treatment the other way is not really the intention. That's not the goal. The exciting thing with these new medicines is that there are more medicines in the arsenal now that we can use to address symptoms. And so hopefully we'll lower the barriers and allow more people to return to duty quicker and hopefully with fewer reviews. My gut, I don't speak for anybody except for myself today. All of these opinions are absolutely my own. I do not speak on behalf of the FAA, but my gestalt is that this is going to continue to evolve over time. In 3 months, every 3 months, the AME guide has major revisions. Mm-hmm. In 3 months from now, I suspect that we will also see more revisions coming our way.
Interesting. Okay. I don't know if I knew that. We learned so much more on this podcast. So
every month there's edits, but every 3 months are major revisions.
Okay. So we're talking about mental health right now. Now, there are plenty of physical health things that keep pilots from disclosing to their AME. For example, of course, no names are being mentioned. I know a person who has sleep apnea, and they will not disclose that to their AME because that is a situation where their medical could be pulled. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that have physical things. So tell me a little bit about how you see, are there any differences or difficulties for pilots? Like, where is that divide, like between the physical and the mental health stuff? Because pilots are going to keep this stuff close to their chest, many people, no matter what rules are out there, for both physical and mental things. It's just a given, right? I mean, this is the world we live in. How do you see it being different? So like, say, for example, this person I know who has sleep apnea flying, and maybe he shouldn't be flying, he's not disclosing it to his AME, as opposed to somebody who has depression, anxiety. Like, how do you see these two compare?
Absolutely. Well, definitively, mental health is human health. It's all the same. We're all the same computer, whether it's a software problem or a hardware problem. It's all the same computer. When it comes to aeromedical certification, mental health does pose unique challenges. And I mean that, I don't, this does not apply to everybody, but one way to think about it when I talk to my physician colleagues, because I actually talk to physicians about this problem too. In the emergency department, if you see a pilot roll into the emergency department with headache, you may want to be thinking about a workup at a different cadence. For example, an outpatient headache problem. You might want to think about imaging and doing next steps sooner than a non-pilot because they might have been sitting on this far longer. A pilot presenting with chest pain, same thing. We have data showing that pilots are more likely than non-pilots to delay seeking care for chest pain than the non-pilot controls. Interestingly, the healthcare avoidance data is all types of health, not just focused on mental health. And so it gets down to, how do we think about this in a different way? And each of these types of conditions pose different aeromedical risk. And so I think from a medical perspective, we approach them, we should be approaching them similarly. From a certification perspective, I think we can add a little bit of nuance. As it relates to flight instructors, though, in many ways, the access that pilots feel that they have, the perceived healthcare access in many ways, is formed by one of the first flight instructors they have. What a pilot feel that they can access in aviation, can they see a therapist? Can they see their doctor? In a lot of ways, that vision is painted through the lens of their first flight instructor. The listeners on this podcast have a tremendous responsibility about how we frame the AME pilot relationship, about seeking a medical certificate, maintaining a medical certificate, and the inevitable thing that will happen to most of us is the need for a special issuance, or we need to seek medical care at some point. And that gets back to the opportunity about teaching health literacy, teaching how do we navigate the aeromedical certification system so we're not afraid of it, but airmen are empowered to participate in the system, to meet their health and do so in a safe way. Interestingly, sleep apnea has an amazing accelerated protocol that's super clear and very quick. And actually in mental health during the ARC, we actually looked at the sleep apnea protocol as an example of how to do this well. And so it's how we perceive it. And a good CFI has the chance to be a superhero by knowing these protocols and helping people in a positive way navigate this by empowering them with knowledge and confidence to do that. Will everybody be able to get a certificate on the same day? Unfortunately, no. But by coming to the certificate exam with all the information, all the right reports, who do you need to see first? What type of information reports do you even need to bring? That's the kind of stuff that can help accelerate these processes.
Well, thank you for making those comparisons. And one of the other articles in this issue of Mentor was by NAFI board member, Dr. Victor Vogel. He also talked about pilot mental health. He's done a couple of Mentor Live broadcasts this year on this topic. And he's very clear about mental health is health. They're one and the same. And there's that, of course, that stigma and that sort of schism, but thank you for reminding us of that. You also bring up a really great point. Two things I'm thinking of. One is that CFIs need to be aware of these changes that are coming quite rapidly down the pike, and also um, uh, where how do they keep up with it? You know what I mean? And so, like, something that happened, like for example, the recent ruling just last week, a lot of people might not know about that. So you could have outdated information because it's rapidly changing. So I think a challenge and a sort of call to action for the flight instruction community and all pilots for really is keeping up with this rapidly shifting situation. So of course, as editor for NAFI, I try to publish this information. I put it in yesterday's eMentor newsletter about the recent FAA changes with the ARC stuff. So besides NAFI members looking at NAFI publications, what would you suggest flight instructors do to kind of keep appraised and abreast of this rapidly changing landscape that we're in?
There's no easy solution. In a world of tons of information coming our way, how do you cut through the noise? It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Um, that I think it goes back to what I said in the beginning, is this understanding that we all have a role to play in creating the aerospace system of the future that we want. And I think, organizations like this, exactly the work that you're doing, Beth, is empowering members with that information. How do you make it accessible? How do you make it so that members naturally encounter it, so they have it at the point of operation? This includes social media, which is free, and other programs. My impression is that many people are looking to the FAA to help make this happen. Um, and I, for example, the distribution of information. And I think that's part of the puzzle, but I think the rest of the puzzle falls on us to bring about that distribution of information.
Sure. So so I get letters to the editor about different information that is published in the magazine. And soon after the May-June issue came out, I got a letter from a NAFI member who enjoyed the medical issues that were in Mentor magazine. And he said, I feel the articles discussing mental health and aviation looked at the medical process through rose-tinted lenses. The truth is that the road to coming back from any sort of mental health related diagnosis is long and expensive. So this was written a few weeks ago. So already, but again, things don't shift on a dime overnight, right? So like, what would be your answer? What would be your comments and your feedback to this particular individual writing into us?
Absolutely. First and foremost, the system is far from perfect. It's prolonged. It is expensive. It can be unpredictable. Pilots can feel that they don't have autonomy through this process, and it could be uncertain and a pain. And so those feelings are absolutely valid. Uh, that said, there are problems that we can address head on and fix that we have control over. And there's problems that, unfortunately, that we don't have direct control over. For example, the aeromedical certification decision, does the pilot meet the minimums? Yes, no. That's always going to exist in some way, probably, no matter where we draw that line.
Mm.
But how we help the processes around making that decision, and how we inform others as we approach that, makes it easy, can hopefully make it a little bit easier. So for example, a common problem that I see, and I'm not a current AME anymore for research purposes, but are stories of pilots applying for a special issuance too soon.
Hmm.
They're not ready. They're not medically stable. Either they're not medically stable to do so, or they don't have the relevant, unfortunately, the paper trail to demonstrate that they're ready to do that. And then what happens is, for better or worse, as things currently stand, is that gets mailed to the FAA, it gets uploaded in a computer, it gets reviewed by an analyst at some point, and then it gets reviewed by the committee. It's missing one or two documents. It gets sent back as a letter to the airman. The airman has to go to their doctor, and you can see how this is how these certificate processes take months or years. If a pilot might instead know that it's honestly just best to take your time and get better. That's really the best you can do. That is the fastest way to get a certificate. Don't fly if you don't meet the criteria. Be safe. Get the help that you need. When you're ready to do so and your healthcare professional agrees with you, work with a really good and experienced AME and a really good HIMSS AME if you're working with a medication, and make sure that you meet all the criteria in these checklists. And admittedly, the SSRI, which is a medication for mood, that's the current name of the certification protocol, is multiple documents that you have to have all together and submitted. Working with the Good HIMSS AME knows this process, and don't submit until you're ready to do that. That is, while it feels paradoxical, it's actually the fastest way to get your certificate back.
I'm really glad you brought this up because I think people, again, sort of to try to sort of put the physical and mental in one bucket, as it were. We all know pilots who had cancer or a heart attack, right? And they lost their medical temporarily and they ended up getting it back. Not everybody, of course, but if you've completed treatment and you pass a test, okay, or you can be a pilot again. Next issue of Mentor, there is a CFI who broke his neck and was almost paralyzed, but he's almost better and hopefully, fingers crossed, he's going to be able to fly again. So of course, in these types of situations, we're like, duh, of course you wait until you get better. And no one would expect this guy is going to be able to fly with a broken neck and be paralyzed. Like, we understand that. We understand if we're undergoing chemotherapy or we're having cancer treatment, we can't fly. So we almost have to, like you said, just apply that same sort of reasoning to mental health issues.
Exactly. I know pilots are superheroes. I believe that you are all superheroes. The type of person that's willing to be responsible for 250 people at 32,000 feet over the North Atlantic and be ready for an engine failure, a weather emergency, and a sick passenger all at the same time and say, I got it, may not naturally have the same skill set to raise their hand and say, you know what, I need to step away from flying because I need some help. Unfortunately, and fortunately, we're all just regular human beings. Sometimes we need a little support along the way. And in building that culture where that's okay to seek that help, I think is going to be a big part about building that system. Anecdotally, our rising generation, my suspicion, many of the students that our instructors interact with, anecdotally feel that way. Social mental health may not have the social stigma that it once might had. And remember, a pilot in 1980 saying I'm depressed might mean something different than a pilot who's 21 years old in 2024 saying they're depressed. And so we're also grappling with the change of the use of language, the change with diagnoses, health access, and many, many more. So it's an evolving process. But I think the future is bright.
That's a really good point, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So thank you for saying that. And I also have to say, sort of as we start to wrap up here, Billy, I was going to say Dr. Hoffman, this has been such a valuable conversation, and thank you so much for having this conversation on the podcast. Thank you for writing this article. And what I would like to do at this point is I would like to share with our listeners, and maybe share with you too, Billy. I'd like to I make no secret that one of the reasons I do this podcast is to build business for people to contribute to Mentor Magazine. And so I like to show a little bit kind of how the sausage is made behind the scenes, because to get this to have a person of Billy's caliber writing for Mentor and being on the podcast, this is, we're so grateful and honored that you're doing this, but this didn't just happen, you guys. So I'm going to reverse engineer a little bit of how we got here having this conversation today in June of 2024. A few years ago, I edited this book. It's a book called, written by Renee O'Shaughnessy, called This Is Your Captain Speaking, What You Should Know About Your Pilot's Mental Health. And she was so excited when she reached out to me and said, Beth, this gentleman named Dr. William Hoffman is going to write the foreword for my book. And she was so excited because he's one of the foremost experts in this field. And so Dr. Billy Hoffman wrote the foreword for this book. So that was how he first flipped on my radar several years ago. But I didn't, just like, okay, this like badass like pilot, and doctor who's an expert in this field. So then fast forward a couple years later, and I happened to be texting with Dana McElwain, who is one of the authors of NAFI's The Right Seat column. And we got talking about books, and I said something about how I edited this book, and she's like, you edited a book? And I'm like, yeah. And I sent her the screenshot, and she's just like, oh, Billy, I went to college with him. And I'm like, oh my God, really? Dr. Hoffman of Renee's Forward? And so then I said, do you think he might want to write an article for our magazine? And she's like, reach out to him and ask him. So I got her contact information from Dana, reached out to him. I didn't know if he'd have the time because he's such an important person. And he was so gracious, and you were so gracious and said yes. And you wrote the article, and now you're on the podcast, and here we are. So
You're blowing a lot of smoke. You're blowing a lot of smoke. I'm honored and I'm very humbled, but and I appreciate your kind words. And please know I'm just like everyone else on this podcast. I care about this topic just like everyone. I'm a lover of aviation, and I think we all collectively want to see a brighter, more inclusive aviation tomorrow. So I appreciate your kind words, though.
Well, no, and I know you're very humble about it, but the way I do research on people is I lurk on LinkedIn and social media and find out about them. And when I went onto LinkedIn and started seeing some of the things that you've been affiliated with and associated with, I'm like, whoa, this is pretty good. But the reason I'm bringing all this up, you guys, is because we all have our contributions to give. And whether you're a doctor, whether you're a flight instructor, whether you're a pilot, you don't have to be a flight instructor to be a NAFI member. We all have our stories to share. And I bring all this up is that there's like maybe 1 degree of separation and so many interlocking, and it's kind of magical. Like it is kind of magical,
Mm-hmm.
the way it all sort of works and how it all sort of weaves together. But it doesn't just automatically happens. You have to reach out to people. You have to ask. And you know what? Sometimes people will say no, and that's okay too. So I think that just putting yourself out there and giving of your time and energy, and we all have our different areas of expertise. We talk about a lot of different things on this podcast, and we talk about a lot of different things in the flight instruction ecosystem. So this is a very important one. You're an expert in it, and so we really appreciate your helps in your comments. And this is such a fascinating topic, and there's just going to be so much happening. So as we wrap up, Billy, where do you see us going from here? So like you're talking about 2023, 2024. What do you see for like the rest of this year and next year? What do you think might, I know you're I'm asking you to put on your crystal ball like hat.
Exactly. Well, it's a period of tremendous change in our field of aerospace medicine. Actually, taking a step back, there have been so many examples in periods of great change in medicine. We saw in COVID that there was rapid innovation in medicine to meet that demand. In my own field of neurology, Alzheimer's disease drugs, with great challenges have come great innovation. And I think what we're seeing here is a period of a great challenge being met with great innovation from many places: the Aerospace Medical Association, the safety organizations, the flight instructing organization, the regulatory organizations. This great challenge is being met with great innovation. It's hard to know where the future holds, but I think we have a chance to have a say in what should that future look like. I think by first painting that future, studying it, and in demonstrating that future is safe, that's how we build incremental steps forward. Part of it is open. Remember, at the end of the day, our regulatory organizations aim for flight or to be exceptionally safe, and we have achieved that. So as we adjust rules and we rethink things, we need to also be thinking, how do we demonstrate that these changes are doing what we intend them to do, lowering the barriers to care, but also that they're safe? How do we do that in a systematic way? Are open questions, but questions that I know many are excited to go after systematically.
Well, and I think one of the sort of circle back to something you said at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the law of primacy, and the law of primacy is what your students learn first is going to color their opinion in their thinking about something forever. So I think it's super important. And any takeaway from this conversation, one of the very important ones is instructors, how are you portraying mental health and health in general to your students? And maybe do a little bit of research, look up those two, the studies, look up the rulemaking committee, and also just do a little bit of research, and I'll do my part to help make that information available to you. And we'll also put it in the show notes for this podcast, just so you guys can click links and have that there. So Billy, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative, and I really appreciate you taking the time both to contribute to our magazine and also to take time here on the podcast.
It is truly my privilege. I so admire, what you all do and the work of flight instructors. I'm incredibly grateful for my flight instructors, and so to support and learn from you all is truly a privilege. It's amazing. Many years later, I still remember the offhanded comments that are wonderfully resonate in my mind about wisdom of flying or wisdom of care. All these years later, I still remember that. And flight instructors every day have the chance to paint those little moments in students' minds, and maybe in the next week try to make one or two of those about mental health.
Excellent. Great. Good call to action at the end here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And everybody,
Thank you, Beth.
You're so welcome. Everyone, thank you for joining us for the Writers Behind the Stories. Be sure to leave your comments, like, subscribe, and join me next time. I invite you to consider sharing your stories. We'll see you next time on the Writers Behind the Stories on NAFI's More Right Writer podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. I hope you enjoyed Beth's conversation with Dr. Hoffman. He offered some great insights for CFIs to help us better understand our influence on pilots' perceptions of the medical application process. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to receive every episode for more useful information for every CFI, and check out nafinet.org to join or renew. Use the code POD49 POD49 for your $10 discount.